The Chronicles of Uzaya, a novel by Robert Ray. This audiobook is narrated by Silas Grim, an AI voice built from scratch. No human voice was used in the recording of this audio. Chapter 6. The Quagmire. Part 1. The Summoning. The deep cult did not serve the Ancient One. They did not fear the spiral. They worshipped what lay between, entities that existed in the dimensional layers adjacent to material reality. They were scholars turned devotees, researchers who had dared to push past lines others refused to cross, only to discover that the spaces they studied were inhabited by elder beings, all too aware of their scrutiny. The Drow Empire knew of the deep cult and feared the consequences of their rites, but the ambition to retake the surface realm once more far outweighed their fear. They did not turn to the cult out of desperation, but to prepare. Contact was made. Terms were set. The nature of what would answer could not be controlled. There came a point where caution no longer applied. Tonight was such a night. They gathered in the lightless deep, far below the reach of surface sound. 17 figures assembled in a cavern deep beneath the quagmire. The site had been chosen for its proximity to the gates of Valros, not for secrecy. The ritual would pull its answer toward this point, where the Drow Empire intended the blow to fall. What arrived would follow the call. Where it resolved could not be controlled. No torches, no lanterns. Darkness here was absolute, a pressure that bore against the eyes until even the memory of light thinned. To the Drow, it was irrelevant. At the circle's center, one figure knelt. His posture was deliberate, balanced, as if waiting for a precise moment rather than pleading for one. The darkness held until the first candle was lit. The flame was small and controlled. It did not push the dark back so much as puncture it. A second candle followed, then a third, each placed along lines etched into the cavern floor. The pattern was not circular. Angles overlapped and repeated, resolving only from where they knelt. More candles were lit. Distance warped. Depth fractured. Shadow intruded. Each of them held a gem, none alike. A diamond split the candlelight into cold facets. A ruby absorbed it until it glowed from within. Sapphire, emerald, amber, each chosen with intent. The central figure spoke. Kathulmar. The name settled without echo. As the final syllable fell, the gems dulled. Then they were gone, leaving nothing behind. The cavern did not collapse. It withdrew. Heat and humid air replaced the chill of stone and darkness. They stood within a vast, ruined temple, choked by jungle growth. Pillars rose like broken trunks into a fractured dome. Vines and broad leaves claimed the stone. Roots splitting blocks carved by hands long vanished. Enormous statues loomed through the overgrowth, depicting noble figures eroded by rain, limbs broken where roots had forced the stone apart, faces emptied of expression. The builders of this place had not endured. Only the candles remained in place. They stood exactly where they had been before, flames steady, light unaltered, as though the world had rearranged itself around fixed points it could not dislodge. The kneeling figure rose and crossed to a low stone plinth. From his robe, he produced a small, ornate box and set it down with care. A single folded sheet followed. He placed the note inside, closed the lid. A fire was lit around it. Nothing of the box caught, Nothing of the note blackened. When the fire reduced itself to embers, the air shifted. The temple, the jungle, the statues folded away at once, as if the space itself had completed a task. They were back in the cavern. The candles still burned. The work was finished. Miles to the north, at the edge of the woods beyond the quagmire, something answered. The ritualist opened his eyes. He did not speak aloud. The command passed through the connection they had forged. South. Consume. There was no reply. None was expected. Part 2. The Long Crossing. Dawn found Uzaya already moving. The fire had burned itself down to orange embers. He scattered the coals with his boot, shouldered his pack, and moved on, though the memory of the thing in the basin refused to leave. He saw it again, the way the creature's smooth head had pivoted toward him. No eyes, no face, only awareness. His body remembered before his thoughts did. The image stayed with him, fixed at the back of his mind. He continued south. The trail was rugged, broken by shallow gullies and soft, waterlogged ground. He moved as though Eldenport lay just beyond the next rise, a thought he repeated with every mile, every hour, every faltering step. Just beyond the next rise. Just past this ridge. Just through these trees. But it wasn't. Branches shifted in the windless air, and his body tensed, expecting the weight of something massive moving through the trees behind him. It didn't come. He walked faster. By midday, the terrain dropped into slick clay slopes and water-scoured channels. He passed old watchstones, half sunk in the ground, each more weather-worn than the last. Some bore crude symbols, angular marks, purposeful. He'd seen similar cuts on the bones tied to the trees days before. He kept his eyes on the tree line ahead and picked up his pace. The ground began to soften. Soil surrendered to damp, spongy earth. Mud kicking stones slick with lichen. Trees grew wider apart, hunched and rotting, their roots exposed like grasping fingers. The air turned foul, tainted with the sour stench of stagnant water and fermenting peat. He had entered the quagmire. Something splashed ahead. A bogworm hauled itself from a dank pool. 6 feet of rust-red chitin, slick with oily water, and trailing strands of rotted vegetation. Its many legs gripping the mud in perfect coordination as it crossed toward him. Its blunt, eyeless head swept left, then right, tasting the air. A faint warmth stirred beneath Uzaya's pendant. A thin, ghost-like wisp gathered around it, briefly forming the outline of an eye, lidless and depthless. It did not speak. It did not linger. But in that brief moment of attention, knowledge settled into Uzaya's mind, fully formed. The creature ahead was a bog worm, territorial, not hunting, not hostile unless threatened. The wisp dissolved. The warmth went with it. The bogworm clicked once, slid into the next stagnant pool, and vanished beneath the surface. The water barely rippled. The quagmire did not change. Standing water lay filmed with green. Reeds whispered against one another. Gnats hung in the air, unmoving. The smell of stagnant water and decay settled into every breath. It stretched endlessly. The trees were dead, their trunks bare, branches lacking leaves or growth. Bulbous sacs, the color of old fat, clung to exposed wood, glowing faintly with bioluminescent veins. Some had burst, trailing slick black threads down the grain. Marsh crows circled overhead. Bloated carrion birds with ragged wings and sparse, molting feathers. Their plumage was greasy black. When they cawed, the sound split the air, harsh and grating, too close to screaming to be mistaken for birdsong. A yellow haze lay along the northwest flats, low and pallid, its edges blurring the land beneath it. The air carried a sour stink that reached him even at this distance, sharp enough to prickle the back of his throat. Within it, trees stood as faint silhouettes, their outlines softened, the mist nearly erasing them. Dark shapes drifted there, distant and unresolved. Too slow for weather, too numerous for chance. Uzaya could not tell whether they moved of their own will or were being borne along by the mist itself. He kept walking, and the shadows in his thoughts walked with him. By the second day, most would have collapsed. Uzaya's legs trembled, his vision blurred, but he pushed on, driven by will and something in his blood that refused to let him stop. His body moved on instinct, past exhaustion, past thought. The quagmire deepened. Low hummocks of peat broke the surface at irregular intervals, soft underfoot and crumbling at the edges. Narrow channels wound between them, their banks sagging where the soil could no longer hold. Deadwood lay half submerged, bleached and smooth. Mud dragged at his boots. In the shallows, firm footing vanished without warning, solid ground dropping into deeper pockets that forced him to brace and pull free. The water carried a sour trace of decay. A heron lifted ahead of him, thin and ragged, patches of bare skin visible along its neck. It rose without a cry and disappeared into the mist. By mid-afternoon of the third day, the ground began to harden. Pools of standing water ran clear now, no longer skinned with oily scum. Willows took the place of dead trees, their branches spreading over low scrub and weathered stone. A gull cried overhead. Uzaya paused. For 2 days, there had been only silence and the screaming marsh crows. The gull's call cut through the gray air, sharp and real, and he felt something lift inside before he was aware of it. Another gull answered. Then another. He started moving again as the air shifted, cooler now, carrying salt from the distant sea. Coarse grass rippled across the moor instead of sinking underfoot. A rabbit bolted across the path. A lark sang from the next rise. Uzaya pushed on. He dragged himself up the final rise, one step at a time. His breaths came shallow and tight, never quite enough. His legs ached with a dull, settled fatigue. His cloak was stiff with dried mud. The ridge opened before him. East and west of the city, farmland spread across the coastal plain. Fields of barley and rye, broken by low rises and drainage ditches. Scattered villages sending up thin threads of smoke. Roads converged from all directions, drawn toward the massive walls that dominated the open land. The gates of Valros. They rose nearly 100 feet, carved from cyclopean granite and bound in black-forged iron that had never rusted. Runes older than any living tongue were carved into the surface. Flanking the sealed central gates stood the Valric twins, 2 constructs, each 80 feet tall, motionless, eternal. Guardians, said to wake when the city was threatened. Before the gates, market activity clustered in the plaza. Travelers queued at the side passages while guards checked papers and inspected wagons. Beyond the gates, the city sprawled across the peninsula. He could make out the rise of tiered stone, the dark silhouettes of towers, smoke rising in thin columns. To the east, where the land met the sea, fog rolled thick and gray across the water. Uzaya's legs buckled as he took it in. He caught himself against the rock, waited for the shaking to ease. Then began the descent. Chapter 7. The Crooked Keel. The descent took longer than it should have. Uzaya's legs refused to cooperate. Each step down the ridge a negotiation between will and failure. Beyond the peninsula, the ocean opened wide and blue, stretching unbroken to the horizon. Roads converged across the plain through amber light, all of them drawn toward the gates of Valros. By the time he reached the flatlands, the sun was sinking toward the sea. He followed the road as it meandered toward the city, the noise of voices and wagons growing with each step. The gates loomed. Rooms he didn't recognize traced the surface beneath grime, carved deep enough to catch shadow. Flanking the sealed gate stood the Valric twins. Uzaya had heard the name his whole life. Stories told in northern taverns, whispered around fires. Even the name had no single origin. By the time Eldenport was built, they were already there. Constructs forged in an age before memory. Legendary. But they were real. Dwarven work, from the age before the Storm Kings, when the surface was ruled by many peoples, not just one. The joints proved it. Precision no human mason could replicate. Mechanisms still functioning after thousands of years without maintenance. The dwarves who had carved them were long dead, or driven deep into the mountains, their knowledge buried with them. Each construct rose above the plaza, carved from stone and banded in corroded iron. Humanoid in shape, but wrong in proportion. Torso too wide, arms too thick, fists too massive. Their faces were smooth, nearly featureless, impassive. The automaton on the left held a massive sword at its side, the blade nearly 30 feet of carved stone, half buried in the earth. Centuries of rain and wind had darkened and pitted the lower third. The ground around it had settled and cracked under the weight. Grass grew thick around the hilt. Moss climbed the crossguard where ancient metal bands reinforced the grip. The base was worn smooth where vendors leaned and argued over prices. The hands of the defender on the right were clenched into fists, each the size of a wagon. Deep grooves scored the knuckles, worn blunt from repeated blows against something that refused to break. Its feet had settled into the plaza floor over time. The ground beneath cracked and depressed where the weight pressed down into the earth below. Birds had nested in the heights. A large nest lay wedged into the crook of the sword-bearer's shoulder, built from gray, weathered branches. Lower down, birds darted through gaps between the iron bands, disappearing into shadow. The crowd moved around him, paying the guardians no mind. But Uzaya felt the weight of their presence. His stomach cramped with hunger. The dried meat was gone, his water skin nearly empty. But he'd made it. The plaza before the gates of Valros was crowded with life. Traders shouted over the din, hawking goods from carts and stalls. Northerners stood with weathered packs and cautious eyes. River traders held their place with ledgers tucked under their arms. Laborers in mud-stained tunics gathered in the shade of the gates, waiting for work calls. There were food vendors working stations along the edges, smoke rising from braziers, meat sizzling on iron pans, skewered sausages, flatbread baking on hot stones. A woman called out prices for roasted chestnuts, her sing-song voice cutting through the noise. The crowd funneled toward smaller gates, flanking the main threshold, guarded by soldiers in patched armor, checking papers and waving people through. Uzaya joined the line. When his turn came, he produced his identification. Folded parchment stamped with the Holford seal. The guard glanced at it, marked something in his ledger, and stepped aside. Move through. Inside the gates, the street narrowed, and the press of bodies closed in. The flow of traffic carried Uzaya forward, whether he willed it or not. Heat and smoke thickened the air. A butcher's stall crowded the road ahead, sides of meat hanging from iron hooks, fat catching the firelight. Beneath them, a hawker worked a flat iron pan, turning thick cuts as grease hissed and spat. As he approached, his hand moved toward his coin pouch, then stopped. Something was wrong. The smell seemed right, rich, exactly what his body was craving. But beneath it lingered a faint bitterness he had learned to distrust, the same note he had found in certain roots and mushrooms that sickened before they killed. Not the meat itself, something laid over it. Poison. Not enough to kill, just enough to dull the mind, to make a traveler sick, weak, easy to rob an hour later in a narrow alley. Uzaya straightened and met the man's eyes. He spoke directly into the vendor's thoughts. "You would feed me poison?" The man recoiled as if struck. His voice caught, eyes wide. His hands trembled over the pan. Uzaya continued silently, his presence tightening in the man's mind, his eyes holding in there. "I'm too hungry to kill you properly. Be grateful." He turned and walked on. By nightfall, the pallid face of Uzaya was known to those who made their living choosing victims. He was noted and duly removed from their lists. Uzaya's stomach cramped with hunger. His resolve hardened. Clearly, street vendors couldn't be trusted. He wanted a proper meal, somewhere with a roof, tables, a reputation to uphold. The streets unfolded as he walked. Cobblestone lanes stretched away from the gates, broad and well-kept, lined with timber and stone buildings rising 2 and 3 stories high. Shop fronts crowded the street, open doors, shuttered windows, painted signs hanging from iron brackets that creaked softly in the evening air. As dusk deepened, amber light poured from open doorways and windows, falling in uneven bands across the street. The air carried the layered scents of the city: baking bread, roasting herbs, sweet wine, the odor of cooked meat. Voices overlapped. Laughter drifted from open windows and balconies above the shops. Somewhere nearby, a fiddle played, quick and bright. Merchants called from doorways. Apprentices hurried past with bundles under their arms. Travelers slowed, craning their necks, while locals moved with practiced ease, weaving through the flow. Near one of the wider plazas stood the Emberlight Inn. Its name was etched in steel above the entrance, restrained and deliberate. No barker lingered outside, no list of prices hung by the door. Tall windows shone warmly from within. It didn't need to advertise. Uzaya went in. The interior was warm, lit by copper sconces and the glow of a wide hearth at the far end of the room. Logs burned low and steady within it, their crackle soft and constant, the sound swallowing the noise of the street as the door closed behind him. The tables were dark oak, well-joined and unadorned, built to last longer than the men who sat at them. The inn smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, rich and savory, with the deeper warmth of fresh bread and simmering stock beneath it. A few patrons sat scattered throughout, merchants in fine coats, a pair of scholars bent over parchments, an older woman dining alone by the window. He paused just inside the room. The server noticed him immediately. Mud on the hems, travel-worn boots, clothes that didn't belong in a place like this. Ordinarily, that would have been enough. But his skin was wrong, almost white. His hair was a color she had never seen. He met her eyes and said nothing. Gold appeared instead, generous and unhesitating. She waited against the rules and let them bend. Moments later, he was seated near the back, away from the windows, but with a clear view of the door. She returned to the table, sharp eyes. "The roast is venison tonight, served with wild greens. The stew is lamb with barley." "Perfect," he said. "2 servings, bread as well." Uzaya heard a glass clink. "Ale too." He slid another gold coin across the table. The server's mouth almost smiled. "Good choice." Uzaya leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the room settled over him. His legs still ached. His hands still trembled faintly. But he was here, seated, and soon he would eat. The food arrived quickly. Roasted venison, flaked with salt and juniper, tender enough to pull apart with a fork. A bowl of steaming broth poured over wild greens. A second plate sat beside the first, with a thick slice of fresh brown bread, still warm, served with butter, and a clay pitcher of dark ale, nearly black, foam clinging to the rim. Uzaya poured a glass and drank. It was slightly bitter, heavy, with a faint sweetness beneath the surface. He took his first bite. The food was simple, familiar. It carried the memory of northern winters, smoked meats and simple fare, just like he had as a child. His shoulders eased, and a comfortable fullness settled in his stomach. For the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again. He ate slowly, finished the first plate, then the second. The spice bread lingered warm and sweet on his tongue. He drank half the pitcher before noticing that the ale was softening exhaustion into something more manageable. When the server returned, she paused. "Another pitcher?" Uzaya shook his head. "Another slice of bread." She nodded. This time, she did smile. When he finally stood, the weight of the meal and the ale made the world feel steadier beneath him. He left more coin than the meal required. Chapter 8. The Hearth End. Outside, evening had settled over the city. Uzaya walked without hurry, the warmth of the meal and the weight of the ale steadying him after 3 days of fear-driven flight. His body was fed. His mind wasn't. The memory of the basin clung to him like damp cloth. He needed noise, light, real people living normal lives, something to drown out the thoughts of the thing that wouldn't let go. He followed sound into the district's rougher quarter. Laughter, off-key music, curses sharp enough to cut through the cold. The buildings leaned closer here, their facades weathered and darkened by smoke. The smell of sweat, cheap stew, and pipe smoke thickened. A sign swung overhead. The Crooked Keel. Uzaya stepped inside. The heat hit him first. Body heat and hearth heat. Sweat and smoke in the air. The room was packed with sailors, dock workers, traders. In the back, people gambled over tables. Painted women, serving drinks and wearing very little, wove through the crowd with practiced grace. The floorboards were warped from years of spillage, sawdust stuck in blackened mats. A bard massacred a melody in the corner, but no one cared. Laughter moved through the room with the smoke and noise. It was just the place Uzaya was looking for. He slipped toward the far end of the bar, placing his back against the wall. The bartender was thick-armed, his face lined and creased in ways his body was not. "I'll have your best ale," Uzaya said. The burly man glanced along the shelves, then reached up and took down a bronze mug from the top row. He filled it with dark ale, the head overflowing. The first swallow was even better than he expected. Uzaya lowered the mug, A woman's face was carved into the side. Half-lidded eyes set too wide. Her hair worked into writhing serpents. "Where'd this come from?" he asked. The barkeep jerked his chin toward the door. "Down the street to the left. Little ways. Mugsmith. Real strange work. Calls the place the Gorgoneum." He shrugged. "We sell a few of his pieces here. Not cheap." A pause. "Wouldn't buy one myself." He wiped his hands on a rag. "You want to see it? Right past the tannery. You'll smell the forge smoke." Uzaya nodded slowly, fingers tightening on the bronze handle. Something deep beneath the building vibrated, so faint that only the ale in his mug rippled. No one else reacted. He finished, paid, and stepped back into the night. Uzaya climbed toward the ridge above the drowned quarter, the path narrowing as stone gave way to packed earth and exposed roots. The city's noise thinned behind him, leaving only the distant wash of the sea and wind threading through the trees. Hearth-End Lodge stood at the ridge's edge, 3 stories of weathered clapboard facing open air. Beyond it, the land fell away toward the drowned quarter below. Its sign rocked slightly in the night wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, the barkeep barely looked up. Nara was an older woman with gray braids and hands like knotted rope. After curt introductions, she took his coin and slid a key across the bar. "Room 2C, top floor. Best view in the house, if that's what you're after." Uzaya climbed the narrow stairs, exhausted. The room was small. A cot, a single chair, a scarred table beside a shuttered window. The balcony door stood half open, cold air breathing through the frame. He crossed to it without thinking and stepped out into the night. The wind cut sharp, carrying sea spray that slicked the iron rail beneath his hand. He leaned there, letting it hold him up. To the right, the drowned quarter sprawled across the flooded basin. Rooftops sagged into black water. Arches leaned at wrong angles. Canals cut through abandoned streets. To the left, far out on the horizon and half lost in mist over the water, a darker shape loomed. A faint vibration shivered through the railing, barely more than a tremor. Uzaya felt it anyway, deep in his bones, the same subtle disturbance he had felt in the crooked keel. He squinted at the distant tower, but the effort made his head throb. Tomorrow, he would begin asking questions. He went back inside, left the balcony door as it was, and sat heavily on the edge of the cot. Tonight, the city could keep its secrets. Uzaya lay back and let the sound fade. Chapter 9. The Mugsmith. The tremor woke him. Subtle. Half a heartbeat long. Then gone. The morning was cold, the kind that lived in old coastal wood and never left. Below his window, gulls cried over the drowned rooftops. The quarter was waking. He tightened his cloak, took up his blade, and stepped into the hall. Stairs descended at the far end. Faded paintings lined the stairwell, the quarter before the flooding, a world that no longer existed. He came down into the main room. Tables filled the floor. A bar ran the back wall, the kitchen door shut behind it. Nara was at the counter. She glanced up as he approached. "You're early." Uzaya nodded. He turned for the door. Outside, the air was cold. Fog rolled low between the buildings, pushed along by the breeze. He descended from the ridge, following the slope toward the central districts. The northern brick run carried him through the workshop quarter, still quiet at that hour. Another low groan drifted through the district. Distant. Uzaya paused, listening. A carter, reining in his horse, stopped, frowning. "You hear that?" he muttered, then shook his head. "City's sinking more every year." The streets narrowed as he moved deeper into the workshop quarter. A few smithies showed signs of life. Forge smoke, the ring of an early hammer. At this early hour, most shops remained shuttered. The stench of the tannery found him before he reached it. Sharp lime, foul water, rotting hides. He breathed shallowly and hurried through. That sourness was tainted with charcoal smoke drifting from a forge set back behind a shuttered frontage. Heat breathed faintly through the gaps as the north brick run twisted and narrowed. The lane opened into a dead-end courtyard paved in uneven stone. Stacked barrels and split crates were pushed against the walls. The building at the courtyard's end was more bunker than workshop, with deep-set door frames, no ground-floor windows, and a reinforced door banded in steel. Above it, a simple wooden sign hung from a bent iron rod. Mugsmith. No flare, just the word burned into the grain. Uzaya pushed the door open. Heat rolled out. Steady, controlled. The kind that came from coals kept burning through the night. Lamps hung from iron hooks, their light flickering against rows of masks and sculptures arranged along the wall. Some shelves held bronze figures mounted on highly detailed bases. A bear raised on its hind legs, jaws open. 3 wolves captured in a low prowl, heads low. And among them, the same woman's face from the mug he'd held at the bar, serpent-crowned and sculpted into the side of each piece. Uzaya felt sure the mug was made from memory, not imagination. In the back of the room, a wide stone forge glowed with banked coals. Tools hung from hooks above it. A crucible rested on its lip, a thin tier of cooled bronze trailing down its side. A man worked at the anvil. Older, gray at the temples, thick-shouldered. Hands steady except for a faint tremor in the left. He adjusted a detail piece with practiced familiarity, lifted it to the forge light, and slowly looked up. "You're here about the mug," he said, as if he expected the question. Uzaya stepped closer. "You're Medusa." It was real? The man's left hand twitched. Uzaya let the silence stand. The forge crackled softly. "I make them again and again," the man said quietly. He gestured toward the shelf where many mugs of the same woman were meticulously crafted in bronze, variations repeating endlessly. "I had to get it right." Uzaya's gaze hardened. The mug's face, the eyes sit too far apart, wider than human. The man stiffened. His breaths came shorter. "You've seen one." Uzaya nodded once. "North of Holford, years ago, from a distance." The man exhaled slowly. "Then you know what it's like to see something that shouldn't exist and survive it." Uzaya's jaw clenched. He remembered the basin, the eyeless thing turning, the pressing weight of its awareness. "Yes," he said softly. The mugsmith stepped away from the counter, poured water into a clay cup, and drank without offering the same. His eyes unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond the forge light. He lifted a hand and pointed to a rough map nailed to the wall. Charcoal lines marking the quarter's boundaries, notes sketched in messy strokes. "I saw one. Here," he said, tapping the island beyond the boundary lines. "Liesenhold. You can reach it at low tide. I was scavenging, looking for anything I could melt down." He swallowed. "I shouldn't have gone." His hand tightened. She was gliding, serpents for hair, eyes like... He gestured toward the bronze mugs. Like that. He shook his head once. I ran, and I didn't look back. But I never stopped seeing it. Uzaya's voice was steady. Is she still there? Don't know. A pause. Wouldn't worry about it if I were you. He wiped his trembling hand on his apron. If you're fool enough to keep on, he said. Hearth End Lodge overlooks the quarter. Best place to watch Leesenhold from afar. Uzaya nodded once. So that was what he'd seen last night, the silhouette. The mugsmith turned back to his anvil. You buying anything? Uzaya glanced at the shelves, then shook his head. No, but thank you. The hammer rang again, bronze chiming softly as Uzaya left the shop. Outside, the smoke hung low in the courtyard, dulled by the morning mist. The district was waking.